Welcome to the Quantum Economy Podcast. This is a series of conversations during my research for my forthcoming second edition of the Quantum Economy. You can read all about the book under thequantumeconomy.com. Today I'm talking to John Levy, the CEO and co-founder of SEEQ. He believes chips are the key to the future of quantum computing. John has a fascinating background. He worked alongside Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen and launched one of Intel's first ventures into computer vision. After more than a decade as a venture capitalist, he is now building scalable, energy-efficient quantum computing, or SEEQ. John and I have a lively conversation around the investor perspective in the quantum ecosystem and why he believes it will not be a winner-takes-all market. And he looks into why we now need a new generation of quantum natives. Here is my conversation with John Levy. And I just want to start with the kind of sort of the meta level or the macro level better to like on the economy. So there's been a lot of things going on at the beginning of 2025, and we see the big players, Google, AWS, Microsoft bringing out all these PR statements and also substantial breakthroughs probably in science and in development. I mean, I would just be interested in your view on this. Are we like moving into some kind of commercialization of quantum technologies now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, first off, thanks for having me on your podcast and on the show. So look, there's been a number of really important announcements, really beginning in last November, I think, with the Google announcement around error correction, and then followed up by, as you point out, AWS, Microsoft. There have been some other announcements coming from IBM. And what you're seeing, it's interesting, is that these are all significant technology advances from the leading computing companies. Set aside quantum for a moment. These are the leading computer companies. And what's also interesting is that in many cases, it's not even the quantum people that are making the announcements, it's some of the CEOs of these companies.
Right.
And so it sort of elevates the level of these announcements, and I think it's indicating a few things. One is substantial progress. So for instance, if we think about error correction coming from Google, well, what it says is we now know you can do error correction on a quantum computer to create, let's say a logical qubit. That risk has been taken off the table, if you will. Now, of course, we haven't answered, can you scale it? What's the performance? What's the calibration take? There are lots and lots of other questions. But so one of them is that they take risk off the table. And I think that's really interesting. The second is, I think it's showing their commitment. And you're seeing greater commitment from the major companies that are indicating the level of importance they're putting on to quantum in general. And I think those are the main things that I've taken away. You can look at these announcements and with, less or greater amount of skepticism, when you read the actual papers and you look at the results and say, yeah, but, etc. But here's the thing. Whether or not you believe in topological computing or whether you believe in the implementation of error correction by Google or cat qubits or dual rail qubits from Amazon, the fact is they all represent an enormous investment and some measured progress along the way that suggests that even the largest companies, or maybe especially the largest companies, are paying a lot of attention to quantum.
But they are also more in a very good position because they also have the cash to be in it from the long run, right? So I think this is something that I've been observing is that from coming from startups into a quantum space where there was a lot of capital, and as we both know, a lot of these stock-listed quantum computing companies have a very, very high valuation based on their revenues and in comparison to other tech, which obviously symbolizes an exponential upside as well, potentially, but you also need to fuel that vehicle with additional capital. And you have a background as an investor.
Yeah.
How much do you think, and maybe you could just briefly then also come a little bit into your approach with SEEQ and how you look at the error correction and the energy efficiency and how you have built like the structure for a company that you believe has the foundation for a good commercialization. Because I think this is the challenge right now. How do you keep fueling this engine of progress? So I would just like to hear your thoughts on how you guys do it.
You brought up a whole bunch of topics. So
I went
let me see if I can address them.
Yeah, I'm curious about so many things, John.
So one thought is, sometimes companies are valued on the traditional metrics of, let's call it, the financial metrics of revenue, expense, profit, margin, growth, et cetera, and that all makes sense. But there are other companies that have a very different valuation methodology. So I would bring up biotech as an example, where in a biotech scenario, you can look at a particular problem set. Let's just call it broadly, curing cancer, right? Yeah. Or some form of cancer, or whatever it is. And it is an enormous market. And if you can hit that, you're just gonna, it's gonna go off the charts. And then you have a platform technology, and maybe that platform technology can generate multiple products, but let's just say you have a lead candidate, and then you have milestones. You have collaboration agreements with a major company or major companies in the field, and then you have a kind of well-known regulatory path that you have to get through. So you have to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 2B, et cetera, scaling to phase 3, et cetera. And the point is that at each time that you take a bit of risk off the table, you get closer to the value of the end result. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways, people are applying this kind of methodology, maybe not formally, but I think that there is a kind of informal notion around quantum that is informed by this kind of biotech analysis. Mm-hmm. That's number one. Number two, and I think you know this, between being, I'm a sort of serial co-founder and entrepreneur. I used to work for Paul Allen. I worked at a think tank in Silicon Valley. I started the first computer vision company. I did that for Intel, et cetera. But then I worked for about 10 or 12 years in the venture capital world before coming back to starting SEEQ, actually being the chair of Hypers and then spinning that out and starting SEEQ. And so I have a kind of investor's perspective. It's kind of like I have the devil and the angel on different shoulders here. They're all speaking to me. And so I'm used to the questions that venture investors often ask. And one of them they ask around quantum is, and I know this is going to sound silly, but I hear it all the time, is what's going to win? Mm. What technology is going to win? And I think it's fundamentally the wrong question. It's a little bit like, how many qubits do you have? Right, exactly. These are all, they're well-intentioned questions, but I think they're misplaced. Yes. So let me back up by that. I don't think that quantum is a winner-take-all, enterprise software, build a moat, known metrics kind of opportunity. Quantum is an ecosystem. And what I mean by that is, look at classical computing. We have chip companies, and of those, we have logic, memory, FPGA, ASICs, et cetera, and we have multiple companies that are successful in those areas. We have application companies, operating system companies, system companies, cloud companies, networking companies, et cetera. And in each category, we have at least 2 or 3 companies that are the leaders in that. I think quantum is going to become that. And I think what we're seeing now at the earliest stages is this intense vertical integration, and that companies are going to realize they're not good at everything. Right. I mean, even the largest companies tend to have specialization that enables them to compete and to lead an enormous segment. So with that in mind, I think the way to think about quantum is that you're making investments in that ecosystem. Now, within that ecosystem, you have different kinds of qubit modalities, for sure. And I would argue, A, it's too early to answer the question. B, it's highly likely that we're going to see multimodal quantum computers because different technologies are good at some things and some of them are bad at others. And whether you think superconducting is great because they have fast gates, or ion traps are great because they have long coherence times, or spin silicon is great because they're really, really small and you can build a lot of them, or whatever you want. The fact is that there are pluses and minuses of each. And so I think we need to explore that and see the combinations. Yeah. The other thing is it may be that certain technologies are better than others at solving particular algorithms. And so we need to discover that as well. So our approach is...
Let me challenge you before we get to SEEQ, because I want to get the whole fledge of that. But I just want to challenge you on that, because what I've been observing is if you look at like post-quantum safe cryptography or some of this middleware or layers where you look at companies such as Sandbox or Terra Quantum or even Quantinuum that operates not on the building a computer but also as the layers as you mentioned. So I was observing this and I was thinking, okay, how can a quantum computing company keep momentum? And I thought there would be a lot of consolidations or acquisitions where you build a full stack, where you have a full service provider, where you have chips, you have quantum computing, you have middleware and also application layers in the organization. Because I was thinking about, how do you keep the momentum? So I would just be curious how you see that. I mean, there are companies, if you look at Quantinuum, the major shareholder of Quantinuum is Honeywell, and they're not listed, right? So this could be companies that could scale immensely because of their approach, but if they decide to merge with some kind of quantum computing company or a large organization or be acquired, that will then again fuel that organization. So I would just be curious how you see that.
Look, I think that these companies, in the fullness of time, are going to discover who they are. And what I mean by that is it may be that a company that calls itself a full-stack quantum computing company ultimately becomes a quantum software company. Because we know historically that the value migrates to the answer, right, to the end user. And that's where the highest value is. But you can't do that now because from a sequencing perspective, you don't have the platforms to play that game. So again, I want to go back to the venture perspective. If you're a venture investor, the thing you want to do is you want to invest in the most scalable technology that requires the least amount of capital and that's the most efficient. And from a time from investment to exit is reduced. And that leads you to want to invest in software. But you can't do that in quantum because you don't actually have scaled systems. And we've seen a number of quantum software companies fail for that reason. Not because they didn't have interesting software, it's just because they didn't have this, the platforms to run it on. So I would say, Anders, that it is an early game that we are playing, all these companies are playing, that will ultimately enable them to figure out who they are. We know who we are. We have a very clear sense because we're not trying to do everything. We're trying to do a particular set of things that are highly focused and that go across the entire quantum ecosystem. So again, we're using this construct of an ecosystem and an important player in that, dependent on collaborating with others. Again, that would be like software, except that we're doing it on the chip side.
And you do it agnostically based on the various, players that you can work with. You can attach that basically with IBM, Google, or whatever, and have those partnerships, right? So take me through that, like the decision on your focus for the company.
Yeah.
And maybe you can bake in here a little bit also on your reflection on the use cases, because as you probably know much better than I, the high-performance computing in the conventional GPU, CPU is becoming much more efficient. We are having new energy parts. We are scaling up. So you always have that question coming in, what are the actual use cases, the problems that you will see? I mean, quantum computers, as defined, is a special purpose machine, right? So it's for very complex problems. So the better the conventional GPU, CPUs, whatever gets, the less is left. So I would just be curious also how you see that unfold. But take me through that. decision or your strategy for SEEQ?
Okay, so when we first started, well, I want to go back to talk a little bit about why we started this company, what the inspiration was.
Yeah, why did you leave the investors' race to gather
Yeah.
up the money and get into the quantum spectrum?
Right. In about 2010 or 2011, I was invited to join the board of a company called Hypris. Hypris was and continues to be, a world leader in digital superconducting electronics, and the origin of Hypris was in the superconducting electronics division of IBM. It's why we're based in Westchester, and we're 15 minutes away from Yorktown Heights, the world headquarters for IBM research. And right around that time, when I became the chair of Hypris, the Department of Energy was running a study around projections for energy requirements for exascale classical computers. And what they were showing was that in order to actually build a functional exascale computer, it may well require a nuclear power plant to run a data center. Now that sounded, it's funny, you were talking about like what you were writing about in 2019 and it all sounded like crazy and now it's all happened. Well, here we are. Microsoft is bringing back 3 Mile Island to run a data center to run AI. So this is not crazy. And we didn't think it was crazy either. And so the IARPA, that's, DARPA is for defense, IARPA is for intelligence, etc., started a program around energy efficient classical computing called the C3 program for building scalable superconducting supercomputers. And we were part of that with IBM and BBN, and we built the logic and memory of that system. And what we recognized at that point was that we could use our knowledge around superconducting electronics, and particularly something called single flux quantum technology, SFQ. And our CTO was the co-inventor of this technology to run energy efficient computers. And around 2016, 2017, we said, oh, wait a minute, look at what's happening in quantum computing, running these in superconducting mode. And by the way, Hypris had in 2002 or 2003 made the first qubits for IBM. So Hypris had had a long history of working in quantum. We said, why don't we apply what we've learned in classical supercomputing with superconducting electronics to quantum? And so our idea was we can build chips that operate 10 to the 9th more energy efficient than room temperature electronics, 1 billion times more energy efficient. They can also clock them between 10 and 40 gigahertz, much faster than classical computers, and we can do it at 4 Kelvin and below. So we spun the company out in 2019, and our goal at the time, Anders, was to build, we said, look, we think we can build a chip-based quantum computer with the full stack on chip. And I want to make that clear. We are not talking about just qubits that are superconducting, and then everything else is room temperature and we go back and forth. No, we mean readout, control, error correction, multiplexing, demultiplexing, reset, GPU integration, all of that on chip, at millikelvin, at high speed, at low latency, digital, fully digital. So our notion was, let's build that computer and take on the world. And then I started having conversations with Hartmut Neven and Jay Gambetta and people at Rigetti and IQM and all these companies, and they would say, we have a roadmap, we're looking at our roadmap, and there's a certain point where we kind of fall off a cliff when it comes to scaling all the functions you are building on a chip. And we said, aha, that's an opportunity. Maybe what we should do is flip our model around to say that we will become a seller of all of that core capability on chip, digitally, operating at millikelvin, low latency, low cost. I mean, we're obviating about 70 to 80% of the bill of material of a scaled quantum computer with our chips. And then we learned, after we decided to pivot that way, we started working with Hitachi at Cambridge University, and we learned that our technology could work well with spin silicon. And then we started looking at incorporating single nanowire, single photon detectors, which is work we've done for years at Hypris, and said we could be applicable to all of the atomic or photonic systems. So we came to the conclusion that our technology, in whole or in part, was applicable across the entire quantum ecosystem. So going from a systems perspective and a vertical perspective to a kind of picks and shovel, if you will, arms dealer perspective, where we can sell across the entire quantum ecosystem. First focusing on superconducting, because that's what we're working on. It's also where the market is, frankly. And then sequencing it according to the relevance of our relative relevance of our technology across the ecosystem.
But yeah,
does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I was reading up on this, and quite a bit of what you just told, I was very fascinated by. That's why I wanted to talk to you, because as you said, like you look at, I was speaking also to IQM on their roadmap, and we talked about some of these topics, and exactly that, like, it's a vision, and then we come back to, well, what are the engineering hurdles then? Because it's basically
right.
saying, like, we have a plan, it's going to work out, we're not quite sure on the timeline, but it's going to work out. And then I get into, yeah, well, when it's that, like, clear, what are the hurdles that we need to overcome? And that's always an interesting conversation, because people start to think deeper about what they can say and, their own approach. I would just be interested in how it is with SEEQ. I mean, where do you see the biggest
so first off, and we, I was on a panel with other, quantum CEOs you may have heard at NVIDIA GTC, and I showed an example of SEEQ Orange. All of our chips are color-coded, and our firmware is called Prism. That's what we do. And so SEEQ Orange is our previous generation quantum chip. And so this chip is a hybrid quantum computer, meaning that it has digital XY control and digital demux on it as well. And then it's
walk me through what that is. Just give me, because that's a field that I'm not, like, what is that?
So there are three dimensions of control. There's X, Y, and Z or Z. X, Y is charge control. Z is flux control, flux bias. And so that's how how people control qubits. And typically they do it with analog signals with RF. And just to give you a feel for it, what the stack looks like is you have your qubits. This is superconducting. Your qubits at millikelvin.
Yeah.
The signal is analog. It has to be amplified because it's a very weak signal. It has to be filtered, attenuated. It has to go from cold temperature to room temperature, converted to digital, analyzed, and then you generate control signals, which are RF and analog at room temperature. They have to go back down to millikelvin, and so you have, you've introduced noise, you've introduced cost, you've introduced latency, all those things, but it works.
Yeah, that I get. I was just referring to how it's different. I mean, how was the...
Yeah. So what we're doing is all of our processing is on chip, right next to qubits. They're packaged next to each other, on top of each other. Our signals are not RF, they're digital. So we're using single flux quantum naturally quantized pulses. Each one of those pulses, just to give you a feel for it, is 10 to the 19th joules, so they're very, very low energy. And the way that we control qubits is by the spacing and the number of these pulses in the X, Y, and Z domain. And so we obviate the need for all of those cables. In the case of Google, for their most recent Willow chip, they have 5 cables for every qubit. We obviate the need for almost all room temperature electronics. We obviate the need for all of the RF components like circulators and as I mentioned, traveling wave parametric amplifiers, quantum limited amplifiers, filters, attenuators, etc. And we're doing this all digitally at high speed.
I mean, it seems so so clear, and but I had this in the past with many bright minds like yourself, John, so saying that it sounds sometimes it sounds too good to be true, right? It's kind of sort of like it's just
Yeah.
so. But what I was referring to, like, what are like the challenges then? What is
Yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah. So there are many. So one of them is, this is just sort of a weird conceptual problem, but nobody's ever done this before. And so when you're testing things, when you're testing your readout circuit, for instance, and we have our readout circuits that are working, we're integrating them with companies you know. But we sometimes see effects and we don't know where they come from because nobody's ever done this. And the way that we're doing readout is completely novel. And so testing and designing tests becomes a challenge in itself. That's number one. Number two is I mentioned that we're manufacturing this. And so we're inventing, we have different processes, different cell libraries, different materials. We're working with different tools than we had worked with when everything was at 4 Kelvin. And we were working with mostly RF applications. And so we're having to innovate not only on circuit design and on testing, but also manufacturing. And so we're constantly working on, you want to really take individual things, nail them, and move on. But we don't have that luxury. So we're having to work on all of these things all at the same time. And then we build things on a breakout circuit basis. So in other words, we would do like a separate readout chip, a separate multiplexing chip, a separate control chip, whatever. And then we start to integrate them. And that's a challenge when you start to integrate it. Now, one of the great things about being digital is that we also have solved the issue around crosstalk. So we don't have crosstalk, which is a major problem when you're dealing with RF signals, because you're getting these spurious signals or spurious behavior coming off of the qubit of interest, let's say, where you're seeing the effects of stimulating a particular qubit at a certain frequency, but you're seeing the effects around the qubits around it. And there are techniques you can use, but the more your circuits get complex and the more you have connections with other qubits, you see this effect. Well, you don't see that in the digital domain, right? So in some cases, we're taking big engineering issues off the table, but we're creating new ones based on our novel technology and our ability to design, manufacture, test, and integrate.
By progress, literally. I mean, you generate progress and you learn new challenges, right?
And there are packaging issues.
Yeah.
And opportunities that we're only discovering now. And then one more thing is there are no standards in the quantum industry. So it means that when we work with a company, by definition, it's a bespoke solution. Now, what's interesting is the more we work with companies, the more efficient we get in that process. But it's not like in the classical domain, you develop a chip and you know where it needs to plug into and you know the requirements. We don't have that.
No.
So we have a lot of challenges.
But you're more optimistic than Jens de Wang's initial statements beginning of 2025, where he came out and said, scalable quantum computers are decades away.
Well, I heard what he said.
Yeah.
I heard what he said.
Yeah.
And then I heard what he said at GTC. And one of the things that he said was, I was thinking about how long did it take us at NVIDIA to get from, a zero state startup to where we are today? Well, 20 to 30 years. Yeah. And I think he was sort of thinking that as a reference point, not thinking that the quantum industry had actually gone well beyond the zero state.
Or he wanted to pull off the market to be in on the game, launching the quantum day on the next day. I mean, it's so.
I don't know. Honestly, I really felt, and I really felt this. And I'm not just saying this because we have a collaboration with NVIDIA. We're connecting our digital chips to their digital chips. But I think he really wants this to succeed. And I think he wants it to succeed for the very reason and for the vision that we have. So I don't really look at quantum computing, qua quantum computing, as a standalone thing. I look at computing.
Yeah.
And within computing, there is this thing called quantum. And to me, the notion of connecting CPUs, GPUs, and full stack integrated QPUs, not QPUs like just a package of qubits,
Right,
but
right.
I mean what I'm talking about. Full functionality like a microprocessor means that you're going beyond accelerated computing to heterogeneous compute.
Yeah.
And I think that's the interesting opportunity.
Definitely, but that also comes with a lot of challenges for society, though. I mean, you take me like your thoughts on some of these scenarios and also the potentialities that would fall on such computing power. What are like your thoughts on some of these use cases? I mean, there are obviously benefits to cure. You mentioned cancer, but Alzheimer's diseases, improvements in medicine. You have a lot of these things. But if you look at it from a financial optimization, portfolio management, it's a scale thing that is a winner takes all. Literally, it's speed, it's compute. There are things that also could come with a lot of damage. And although you would have potential to decentralize and lift people out of poverty, it could also be a very, very strong push with capitalism towards centralization, couldn't it?
I don't know. I mean, look, let me sort of bring this back down to earth a little bit, and to say what are the first uses we think of developing this kind of architecture. And interestingly, the first uses that I think about are internal to a quantum computer, and the two that I think about are scalable real-time error correction and qubit calibration. I think both of those would benefit by the inclusion of a very, very low latency, very fast connection between a full stack integrated QPU and a GPU. That's number one. Number two is, I think let's call that looking in, right? As opposed to looking out. Looking out, I think that another area that is sort of internal to quantum computing has to do with using this kind of system to improve the physics of a quantum computer, is literally working on the physics problems. And I think that is a really interesting area. Once we go beyond that, then it goes to areas that I don't know a lot about. I mean, you can talk to the BCG guys and McKinsey guys, you can talk to various quantum companies, and they'll probably talk about molecular simulation for chemistry and pharmaceuticals. They'll talk about financial services, et cetera. But here's the thing. If I had taken you, if it was 1946, and I took you to the basement of the University of Pennsylvania to see the ENIAC, which at the time was designed as an application-specific computer to track missile trajectories for defense, and said to you, no, that's going to be used for having access to a mobile device that has every movie ever made that you're going to download in real time, pay for with your bank account, send an invitation to your friends to watch it with you, and then comment on social media, you would say, that's an adding machine. What are you talking about?
Right.
And I think that's where we are with our thoughts around quantum computing applications.
Yeah. That's a very good example, but also a terrible analogy, because as history teaches us, wars make forces progress in technology. So in order to have a immense progress,
Anders, it's true.
Yes.
If you if you read Chris Miller's book Chip War, for instance, you'll see that the development of the semiconductor and the microprocessor are all a function of the requirements for different wars. Yeah. Now, remember, let's be clear, there are gun shooting wars and there are cold wars, and there are, economic wars. Look what we are doing right now, right? And so all of them introduce externalities that can affect positively or negatively the development and the cadence of development and the resources and requirements for these sorts of systems. So yeah, I get it.
Yeah. No, but I mean, you have a lot of experience and deep understanding of the necessity for capital to scale these type of technologies. But how important is the workforce? So I was very provocative at a conference some years ago where I said, the future Nobel lecturers in chemistry and physics will come out of corporate labs, not out of academia. And what we see today is that there is a war for talent in the quantum space as well. And I don't know, I'm curious how you guys at SEEQ tackle it, but is there a strong necessity for bright minds, or are we quote unquote giving up the authorities to algorithms, so it's more about an engineering issue to tackle the hardware to scale, so that, as you kind of sort of said before, that based on the progress you will have technology that tackles the challenges for building a quantum computer?
Look, we have real challenges around workforce because, again, we're not just designing chips, by the way, chips that very few people in the world can design. These are not CMOS chips. I want to be clear about that. So CMOS, the world is organized around building CMOS chips. TSMC, Samsung, Intel, you've got, fabulous semiconductor companies like AMD and NVIDIA. I mean, you've got, design tools from Cadence and Synopsys and, Mentor Graphics, et cetera. You've got, all the tools companies, ASML, etc. I mean, in other words, the world is organized for that, and we're not doing that. We're building SFQ, single flux quantum chips. You can count on, like, maybe 4 or 5 hands the number of people around the world who can actually design the kind of chips that we need. So that's a challenge.
But is
right
that
on top of that, you need people who can understand quantum to be able to understand that. Lay on top of that, we need to manufacture these chips, and we need to test these chips. So these are requirements. I think of the Venn diagram of theoretical or experimental physics, computer science, electrical engineering, and I'd throw in philosophy on top of all that to say, that's kind of what we need, and then we need to train them to do SFQ. So it's an enormous challenge for us, and we can't. We keep trying to look at, can we use technology? Are there AI tools that can help us, etc. And we are so specialized in what we do; it's really hard to do that. And we talk to the simulation companies and the ANSYS of the world, and the Inductex, and all of these kinds of companies, because we actually need. I know you may not like to hear it, but we need more help from the technology for what we do.
But how do you tackle that? I mean, is it?
We have to have. It's hard.
There's no simple educational answer to that, right?
We bring people on as interns. They train with us. We work with them, while they're getting their masters as early as that. When they're getting their PhDs, we hire postdocs, etc. And we've had very, very little turnover in our company, very little, because people understand the unique nature of what we're doing, and I think understand the vision and the passion and wanting to get it done and the progress we're making, frankly.
Do you think this shapes also education, so that you onboard quote unquote people that have taught themselves at home at a much earlier stage, and you skip that academic track journey, whatever?
I've seen, in our area, I've seen less of that. I see more of that when people are talking about software and working on the application side. But when it comes to chips, it's kind of hard to be a home learner on,
Yeah, sure. Yeah, obviously. I
on
mean,
chips.
yeah.
And
But I
we're a
think
chip
also,
company.
yeah, but I think also still the environment that fosters the educational approach. I was also referring to that kind of sort of lab structure where a part of this education, theoretically speaking, comes out of the corporate environment because you are forced to onboard talents at a much earlier stage and you don't want to leave them to the ivory towers and risk that they go off. So I think this is something that I've been thinking a lot about. Once you have sufficient capital, you could build these educational structure with the brightest physicists and minds within the organization.
Well, people do that.
Yeah.
There are companies that are doing that. We can't afford. We're far away from doing that.
Yeah.
What we can't. The closest equivalent we have is on either our academic collaborations, of which we have several, and bringing interns in. But I would say, look, from an educational perspective, we need to start at the earliest point. And this is kind of a weird bugaboo that I have, which is that we all of us, have been brought up in a world in which our understanding of the world is based on classical physics and the classical model. It just is. We think that way. We process the world that way. We experience the world that way. And we know in quantum mechanics that's actually not the world we live in. But we can tell the story to ourselves about classical physics, and it somehow or other connects to daily life. And it's hard to understand the basic principles of quantum mechanics and the uncertainties and probabilities that are inherent, and things like entanglement and interference and superposition, all these ideas that we know about kind of intellectually, but are very hard to internalize. And it's almost like we need a new generation of quantum natives. And it's not my generation, it's not my children's generation, and it may not even be their children's generation. But we're going to need that. And that's what's going to propel us really forward. And when we think about what those new applications are, it's going to be people who are thinking quantum, who look at the world in that way, and understand that quantum computers are what my team says, which are the tools for the next generation.
This is very much down my lane because you mentioned the philosophical aspect of it.
Yeah.
How do you see that quantum natives? Well, how are they? What are the skills?
I think it goes back to, the analogy that I often use is around art and about the representation of reality. And I don't know if you want to get to this level, but
let's get
bear
into
with me if you do.
Let's get into it. This is where I'm. I love the technology, but I publish with my quantum physicist friend, and we call it sci-fi, PHI, so science philosophy.
Right.
So let's just go down that rabbit hole.
So let's go back into the time of the Egyptians or something like that. And somebody wants to make a statue that represents a person. And they do it. And they do it out of stone, and it looks like this, and whatever it is. And people look at it, and at the time, I'm sure they would say, man, that's a really accurate representation of, Ramses II or whomever, right? That's fantastic. And then we flash forward to, the 9th or 10th or 11th century, and we see painters painting beautiful images of oftentimes religious painting, and you see the background of a town, and people would look at that and say, that's what my town looks like, exactly like that, until somebody somebody comes along in the Renaissance and says, well, wait a minute, there's this thing called scientific perspective, and suddenly I'm painting and it looks different, and now I'm looking at it and people are looking and saying, no, that's what my town actually looks like. That other thing, it didn't look like that. No, it looks like this. And then somebody like, Vermeer or somebody comes in and says, I understand lighting, and lighting as a function also of perspective and shading, etc. And people begin to say, no, that's what it looks like. And at each point, people are able to use a new set of tools to represent the world in a way that we'd never seen it before. And we have to adjust our reality. Now, then I want to just take this one step further and say, now we're at the beginning of the 20th century, and people are no longer thinking that painting is about representing reality or even maybe telling a story, and are going into pure abstraction. That represents not an incremental change, but an entirely new way of thinking and seeing the world. That's quantum. Weirdly, interestingly, that's when the theory of quantum mechanics was developed.
Right.
And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that the art of the time, and also theories of economics, theories of psychology, theories of philosophy, and of politics evolved in a similar way in that kind of zeitgeist or zoosphere idea that was, I think, incubated and supported by what was going on in the development of physics and quantum mechanics. And so it's that evolution of a worldview, a comprehensive worldview. And we haven't caught up there. Right. We haven't caught up with that. It's 100 years later. It's 120 years later. Yeah. And we still haven't caught up with that because it is an enormous change. And it's hard for us to integrate all of that. But we will. We always have.
I agree.
And it's the evolution of humans.
Yeah, and speaking of the evolution of humans, so Florian and I, my co-author, we published the Singularity Paradox, Bridging the Gap Between Humanity and AI, where we argue for an artificial human intelligence. So the things you mentioned 100 years ago, you could throw in psychedelics, enhancements of conscious experiences, but you could also look at hacking chemistry and biology. And what we argue is that a complete externalization of such a machine is something that we will not be able to cope with. Quote unquote, the evolution is too slow. So the only viable path forwards to come into that quantum realm, or as you said, the quantum natives, is to start with the mensch, the human being, and evolve from there. So we kind of sort of take evolution into our own hands. Is that something that you have reflected on, that these quantum natives are enhanced human beings?
I don't know if they are. It's funny, right now I'm reading The Rise of the Machine. Have you read that book?
No, I have not.
Oh, you should read it. It tracks a lot of where you're going, but it grounds it into the origins around the concept of cybernetics and the whole where cyber came from and the man-machine interface and all kinds of, I won't go into all the details of it, but it's definitely well worth reading for you. I think.
Is that the Thomas Reid? I was just looking it up because I have not seen this. Is this the Lost History of Cybernetics from Thomas Reid? All right.
Yeah.
Okay,
super interesting book.
Okay, I have not come across that book. I don't know why. But
right.
It's something
By the way, I would also recommend The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and the book that I also mentioned before, Chip War, by Chris Miller.
Yeah. Thank you for throwing in that. It's good to have the links also added to the description.
Yeah. So look, I haven't really thought about that. I haven't really thought about kind of how we're going to evolve, what the methodology is going to be. It's that it just seems a trajectory that's obvious to me, that we have to evolve this way because we actually understand something about the world we live in that's fundamental, that we haven't quite integrated, but we will, because we always do. And I think that's part of what evolution is. Whether we use these new tools that are available to us or not, I can't speculate. I don't know enough about it. But it seems obvious to me that we will use everything at our disposal to evolve as quickly as we can to be able to incorporate these ideas.
But are you?
It's going to take time, a lot of time, because it's fundamentally different.
It is, and you said connected. That is, to me at least, a fascination because it is not connected. The subatomic world with the perceived physical reality. It's kind of the challenge, but still we can build and do all this amazing stuff on top of this foundational physics. So,
And that's what we're building.
Yeah.
I mean, Anders, that's why I'm doing this.
I see your excitement.
I'm not kidding.
I get your excitement. I would get into that. I was thinking about it, and that's why I want to learn from you guys, and I want to have these conversations because I'm so fascinated by the people that are driving this. And yeah, so thank you for having this passion for that, John. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's the thing that animates me the most.
Right. But I would just want to follow up because I started to think about, you know, so how do you see then this humble little creature called mensch or human being? Are we a computer? Are you a physicalist that accept that it's an underlying physics? Once we get it, we have a brain and a mind, and we can do completely different foundational theories to AI or whatever. Do you think that like this chemical scum, as Stephen Hawking called it, is the totality of the human? Are we a computer?
We know it's not. Wait, let's put it this way. We know it's not because there are physical augmentations that you can have today, right? We wear them all the time. We wear clothing. Some of our clothing is functional. We can have exoskeletons. There are all kinds of things that we know we can do. And we know that we can do internal things. We have all kinds of things for, you know, pacemakers for our hearts and things like that. And so we already know that. We've been doing them for a long time.
But they're just features, though. I mean, couldn't we grasp the essence? I mean, are you familiar with Penrose's work on OR and the quantum brain, basically?
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about that. And I've talked to Hartmut Nevin about this because Hartmut is kind of into this as well. Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, why shouldn't there be some, if there's some intervention with other parts of our bodies, why shouldn't there be with our brain? Like, why? I mean, the part of the problem, of course, is we don't understand the brain well enough, but we will.
But is the brain and things? Do you think consciousness is a function of the brain? Have you thought about that? Is that something that you?
I don't know. You know, we're like going way out there.
We got to get some of your some things you got to be keeping you up until just.
I mean,
it's not just about, you know.
It has to be. I think it has to be. Yeah. But I can't tell you that I understand it, or the mechanisms of it, or how to influence it. I mean, you know, you can experiment with psychedelics, and you can, I think, get a window into the fact that there are different levels of consciousness, for sure. I've had that. I understand that. And so that's, I think that's you know, it's a moment in time when you come to that realization. That's an interesting thing to realize. I don't think it should be a lifestyle. And so I don't know how much farther I can go with that idea, other than to say that we are capable of different kinds of consciousness, and there are moments when we experience it.
So this is something that I spend a lot of time. I mean, the whole science of consciousness and the understanding is something I spent a lot of time thinking about. And we wrote a book about the simulation. And so to me, this is very fascinating to talk to physicists about, because I love that you threw in the philosophical part of it, because to me also quantum theory is highly philosophical.
Yeah.
The implications.
For sure.
And also basically when you start to play with it, it have massive implications. So the qualia, the experience of your own experience is 100% nowism. It's subjective. And if that is an outcome of a computation, we'll most likely figure it out. And I think that this is, if you look at all the various theories and concepts of consciousness, is that we make that leap and we start to talk about a different grade or a different level of consciousness. without knowing the totality. So just from a logical reasoning, it's hard to categorize something that you cannot grasp. So we jump into that like shortcut, and we just leave the foundation out. And that's what the beauty of, to me at least, of quantum physics is, that we leave out the foundation, if you like, and then we play on that layer of understanding, which is, you know, magnificent and great work in the math and the understanding. We can build all this amazing stuff without grasping. And just to give you my experience of this, I sat down with 12 quantum physicists in Vienna at the bar, and we talked about, you know, trying to prove that we are not living in some kind of simulation. And they work in the same company, but they have fundamentally different understanding of quantum theory. So some are in the Copenhagen, some are more in the multi-world interpretation. And as this is
locality and non-locality and all that stuff. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Well, by the way, there's another book that I'm going to recommend you. Somebody pointed it out to me, actually one of my investors, because we had a dinner at another one of our investors. The three of us were sitting around talking about kind of exactly this point. And he said, have you ever read a book called The Rigor of Angels by William Edgington? And it's looking at the work of Kant, Borges, and Heisenberg. And really looking at the philosophical basis for what they were doing, and then the work, right? Like, how did that manifest itself in the books they were writing, in the theories they were putting forward, the research they were doing, etc. And it's super interesting to see how these things track and how they track over time. And I think you would find it really compelling.
It's noted. I've taken that down, yeah. And this is because this is the fascinating part, where you sit and listen in on all these bright minds and the geniuses of physics, and you don't get the essence of the math, but you get the concept of what they're trying to bring across. And then 30 minutes later, you have a complete different concept that sounds just as plausible, that doesn't work with the other one. And this is like the beauty of progress. And I'm a big fan of David Deutsch's work to that extent. And we have, as he also states, an infinite potential to progress. So I love this conversation, John. Thank you so much for opening up also to the philosophical realm. But let's circle a little bit back to the outlooks of maybe like to be very clear on where SEEQ is going. What's next with your company? What are things that you could like to share that you also now can share with quote unquote the market?
So there are not, so you know, it's really important when you're a chip company, when you're really a technology company in general, but especially when you're a chip company, to talk about your roadmap, because people need to know, you know, right now we have SEEQ Orange, but we're now developing SEEQ Yellow. SEEQ Yellow is going to incorporate digital flux bias control, Z control. It's going to include readout, Josephson phase detection readout, what we call JDPD, and it's going to have other functions, for instance, the programmability of some of our circuits, so that they're not just fixed, but they're actually programmable. So we can begin to think about having almost like a router of qubits as a function of our demux and our multiplexing circuitry. And then we think about, so that's one area.
Speed up scaling then, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's meant to speed up scaling. It's also meant to deal with a lot of the things I mentioned before, like crosstalk.
Yeah.
It's meant to reduce cost. It's meant to reduce energy to run a scaled quantum data center from tens of megawatts of power to tens of kilowatts of power. And then we also think it's important to build an ecosystem, if you will, or an infrastructure is better a word for it, for error correction, for real-time error correction. And what we think is, we have ideas about how to do error corrections, but our thought is...
And what do you mean by ecosystem of error correction?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, what do you mean by ecosystem of error correction?
I meant infrastructure of error correction. The ecosystem is the fact that there are companies that have different software ideas around different kinds of codes and methodologies for doing it. So what River Lane wants to do is different from what Google wants to do, which is different from what IBM wants to do. But what we've said is, can we build a chip-based infrastructure in a quantum computer that parses error correction, where we can put some resources on chip at millikelvin next to qubits, some in a decoder, maybe at 100 millikelvin or a Kelvin, and some at maybe a GPU. And if we can have very fast connectivity, very low latency, we can make those resources available for anyone, for anybody's codes, and let them use all of those things, or some of those things, or none of those things, but to be able to build an open architecture so that you can play around with your version of error correction. But we try to optimize it from a processing and connectivity perspective.
Yeah, true. So you outsource some hard problems to the quantum chip, basically the QPUs, and you run it on a conventional GPU, standard processes.
But also a decoder, but also a superconducting decoder.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So that's one area. The next area I think that of interest for us is that in order to make all of this work, we've had to build our own firmware, because we're not using we're not using RF, we're not using analog controls, analog readout, etc. It's all digital, and it's also higher speed than conventional systems. And so we've built our own firmware that we call Prism, and it gives us a really interesting insight into how our chips work, the controls that we give people, and I think it creates an opportunity to do some interesting collaborations with software groups, as well as developing our own libraries of software. So think a little bit about what NVIDIA has done with CUDA, and imagine, given the kind of position that we have, understanding, because we develop them, our chips, it gives us a kind of leg up on understanding how to optimize the features of these chips. So that's an interesting area for us as well.
That's interesting. So what is commercialization wise? You need to fund, raise, scale. When look at revenues, clients, what is the outlook here?
Right. So we have 3 core relationships. We haven't announced all of them. I'll tell you, one of them is with IBM, and we're collaborating with them specifically on the quantum benchmarking initiative, which I think you probably have heard about.
Yes.
But arguably the most important of the scaling programs in the world. I would say there is an equivalent but different effort going on at the NQCC in the UK. We're also part of that. We're actually one of the only companies that's part of both. I think Rigetti is as well. But the point is that from a commercial perspective, it's the insertion of our core technology in other people's systems. Now, different companies, and again, I can't get into all the specifics of this, different companies want us to do different things for them. We're happy to do that. We think ultimately our chips will end up running much of their quantum computer, maybe not their qubits. Maybe they will supply their qubits. They'll supply algorithmic primitives and software, etc. But we will take over a lot of the pick and shovel. Again, readout control, charge control, flux bias control, multiplexing, reset, error correction. The part of it that I've just talked about, that infrastructure, GPU integration, etc.
But in terms of financing and revenues and how do you see the outlook? I mean, the company.
Yeah. So we just closed a $32 million round. We brought in some great investors. We brought in funds. It's interesting. We brought Booz Allen in because of their strong connection to the U.S. government. Yeah. We brought in Arcturn Ventures because they're an energy-focused, climate-focused fund, and they resonate with the work that we're doing on energy efficiency. We brought in Nordic Ninja and SIP because they're based in, all of their LPs are based in Japan. We brought in SG Innovate because they're part of the Singapore government. You know, the point is that our investors are all value add. You know, we have Merck, we have LG, we have EQT, Blue Yard, etc. All of our investors are there, you know, and have been able to add to what we're doing. And I think
Clients
they get what
and
we're doing.
ecosystem providers and competencies. Yeah, that sounds.
You got it.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. So what is your thoughts on the next, like, a near term 24 months? Is there some breakthroughs in the industry that you think will happen? Some player that will come out? Any company you would like to highlight that we should look out for as an investor?
I think we might start seeing, in the next 24 months, we might start seeing the first of what a couple of companies have referred to as narrow quantum advantage. And, you know, you've seen some papers from Continuum, from, from IBM, but I think there are going to be, you know, papers coming from Google, from IQM, from others that, you know, from IonQ, et cetera, that are demonstrating, you know, early, again, narrow quantum advantage. This is not around fault-tolerant computing, broad quantum advantage, et cetera. You know, we're not running Shor's algorithm, et cetera. But I think you're going to see that. I think that's one thing. The second is that we're going to see the scaling up of systems, but where, you know, we've got to be really careful about that, because there are companies that make announcements about, you know, 1,000 qubits here or 10,000, you know, whatever they are, but oftentimes it's deceptive because they're not useful, they're not high performance, they're not error corrected, they're not, you know, this, that, or the other. And so we don't want to go back into the how many qubits do you have game, because that doesn't mean anything. No. But what I do think that we're going to see is we're going to see a larger number of useful qubits. Okay. And maybe, you know, we'll see in the next 2 years, we'll see that jump from, you know, 100 plus qubits to maybe 1,000 qubits, something like that. Somewhere in that range, but where we can take advantage of, they're not just, we can say we have a lot of qubits and they're connected or something like that, but there's some utility to them.
Yep. Do you have a feeling about Ocelot and AWS here? Because I was just reading up a little bit and I had like a feeling that their approach is also quite promising.
I think there are a lot of Anders, I think there are a lot of promising approaches. We see, you know, the work that Quantum Circuits, Alice and Bob and AWS all doing on these kind of dual rail or cat qubits, et cetera. There's work, I mean, look, there are improvements that are being made on the qubit level, on the system level, on the software level, on manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why I go back to this notion around an ecosystem, that you need to look at the progress of the industry. You know, it's one thing to kind of look at it, you know, by company, but if we think about it, we're like an organism, and we're an organism that is evolving and growing, and we're all connected. It's like that. That's kind of how I look at it.
That's a beautiful way to wrap it up. That's a wonderful way. I came into this quantum economy and thinking about this more of an intuition, and I had very much that approach to that interconnectedness and that ecosystem evolving, and you get the momentum. And I'm a big believer in, you know, human beings and brain power and capital paired together. That the economy is literally our operating system of our society, and I've said this many times before, that if we want to have a social, ecological market economy, it becomes social if there's something to divide. So we need, you know, cases that generate profit to fuel the engine. And I think it becomes ecological if economy and ecology become synergistic. And I think this is what you looked at on the energy efficiency, that the term sustainability and I think this is a great challenge for the current government in the US in particular, because they don't understand that at the end of the game, it's not about, you know, these powerhouses. When you drill and you do old technologies, you will have growth and you will have growth. And there we have. That's good. And I think at the end of the day, it will be about efficiency. And efficiency is basically the driver for capitalism. So if you can have hyper efficiency and have the marginal cost of energy come down through new technologies, then you will also tackle climate and challenges with the ecology. And this is something that is not ideology, it's, you know, capitalism. And
right. Look,
so, yeah.
Anders, let's go back to how we named our company, SEEQ, Scalable Energy Efficient Quantum Computing.
Yeah.
We thought about that. That was our inspiration. So thanks for wrapping that up.
That's great.